statistical inference is a procedure that is used to find out the unknown value of the population parameter based on the information contained in the sample. So students, when we have one population, we find out a particular, we are interested in finding out the particular parameter out of that population. But the problem with the population is that sometimes the population is unknown to us. So in order to estimate the parameters of interest, we will have to make use of the sample. The information we draw from the sample is known as the statistic, or we call it as estimator. So if there are two populations and we need to find out that any particular parameter relating to those population, if it is unknown to us, then how to estimate that population parameters for those two populations. So students, here we would be assuming that if two populations are unknown and we need to compare the population parameters of those two populations, then we will be drawing the two samples out of those populations independently. The first sample is to be drawn from the first population and second sample is to be drawn from the second sample. Once we have done that, then the basic objective is to compare the parameters of the two populations. So students, the procedures that we may use to test the parameters of two independent populations that require certain assumptions. For example, if you recall that when we are talking about two populations and we need to compare the population means of the two populations, that whether those population means are equal or they are not equal, then we apply the t-test for those independent samples. So students, the t-test, when we are supposed to apply the t-test onto certain data sets, it requires stringent assumptions such as the normality of the data. So it is required that the two sampled populations must be approximately normally distributed. That means the first sampled population, whereas the second sampled population, both of them that shows normality. Then the next assumption is that both of the populations, they have equal variances. And lastly, we require that the variables that we have drawn from those sampled populations, that must be measured on at least interval scale. That means those variables has to be quantitative in nature and they are either measured onto the interval scale or onto the ratio scale. Now, when the sample population, they fail to follow or fulfill any of these assumptions, that means we cannot apply the t-test for comparing the parameters of two independent samples. So students, if we are given with this kind of situation, that means we require some alternative tests to compare the population parameters. Now, the non-parametric tests for testing the null hypothesis about the two independent samples are, number one, the median test, and the next one is the Mann-Whitney U-test. Students, if you remember, non-parametric statistics जब हम लगाते हैं तो usually हम medians की को टेस्ट करते हैं. अब अगर हमें दो populations, sample populations को compare करना है for their particular parameters, and we are assuming that the parameters of interest are unknown for both of the populations, but we need to compare them or we need to estimate them from the information contained in the sample. तो स्टूडेंट्स, यहाँ पे हमारा जो पैरामीटर ऑफ इंटरेस्ट होगा जिसको हम टेस्ट करेंगे थ्रू नॉन पैरामीट्रिक टेस्ट, दैट विल बी मीडियन. सो मीडियंस हम निकालेंगे दोनों सैंपल्स में से. जो दो डेटा सेट्स हमें दिए होंगे उनके हम मीडियंस निकालेंगे और उनको कंपेयर करेंगे इन दो टेस्ट को यूज करके. जैसे कि मैंने आपको बताया, द फर्स्ट वन इज द मीडियन टेस्ट एंड द नेक्स्ट वन इज द Mann-Whitney test. Now, what are the assumptions that we need to fulfill in order to apply the Mann-Whitney test or the median test? The very first assumption is that the two samples are random. The two samples that we have drawn independently from the two populations, both of them must be random in nature. The next one is that obviously they do not require the normality assumptions that we require in case of t-test. So students, जैसे कि मैंने आपको explain किया है कि non-parametric test में we do not require the assumption of normality. The next assumption is that the data is measured at least on ordinal scale. But it would be better that if we'll be working on to the interval or ratio scale. And lastly, the assumptions we are talking about is कि आपकी जो observations हैं, they must be mutually independent. So students, if these assumptions are fulfilled with two independent samples, then we can apply the non-parametric test to compare the two population parameters that are unknown to us.